Any questions about maybe gear or some of the stuff I've got going here?
Speak real briefly on just your musical history. Was there something that you heard as a kid as you God, I got to play an instrument? And what came first, the keyboard or the guitar? Was there a certain look that just said, God, I got to play guitar?
Let me see. I used to love music a lot when I was 3, 4, 5 years old. I would listen to the radio and kind of showed an aptitude, I think, for music. But it was my grandmother that first, it was really her idea to get me a guitar. I was probably 7 or 8 years old, maybe. And so for probably between the time I was like 6 and 12, I never thought about the instrument technically much. At that time, you know, 73, 72, there wasn't really a wealth of instructional materials out. There was just a couple books, there was no videos, none of that kind of thing at all. So, and I really didn't get into it and jump right into that. I mostly just played a lot of songs and played in a lot of bands. When I was about 12, I started playing in local rock bands. And really didn't think about guitar technique or even lead guitar or anything. I just kind of played what I felt, and it was okay. But I guess when I was about 13, 14, I heard classical music for the first time in such a way to really listen to it. I'm sure I'd heard it as kind of background music. But I heard a record, 2 different records, one record of Bach Goldberg variations performed by Anthony Newman on harpsichord, and then Vladimir Horowitz playing a Moskowski etude on the piano. And when I heard those pieces, it clicked for me, and that was my first, the first records that I loved and what got me into classical music around the time I was 13, 14. And then also when I was 14, I saw Alan Holdsworth play live in 1978, and at that time I was playing just strictly a pretty basic style of guitar, you know, maybe at I guess 13. The leap for me was when I saw Holdsworth when I was, I guess, 14, 1978, and I was like right on the front row. I didn't even know who he was. I went to the concert just because it was $1.03. Yeah, it wasn't any, I didn't know who UK was or Alan Holdsworth or anything. And I was like sitting on the front row, and it just totally boggled my mind and kind of changed my whole life in some ways. And I continue to love Alan Holdsworth very much. He's a great person and a great artist, and so he was a big influence on me. And then the third major thing was then when I was 14, I got with Black Oak, Arkansas in 1978 and played probably about 4 years with them in like stadiums and coliseums and all these big gigs, which for a kid at my age, it was kind of a weird trip, you know. And I don't know that I would let my 14-year-old kid go out on the road with these guys, you know. And my parents were really lenient about it. I kind of thank them now in a way because of the experience I had, but I don't know. And so I did that for a few years, and toward the last couple of years of Black Oak, we got a keyboard player that was really well versed in classical and played some Liszt and Rachmaninoff. And when I saw him play it sitting there in front of me, it made it make even more sense. Instead of it seeming like something in a museum or something that is old or whatever, when I saw a guy really play it live, it totally changed the way I thought about things. So those were the biggest influences at that time. And ever since then, I think, and then I kind of went into maybe a practicing phase somewhat on the guitar and worked out most of the technique that I have today between the ages of about 14 and 17. And ever since then, I'm 17, I haven't really worked on guitar techniques per se, but I'm always studying music, different types of music, different ways of playing. And in the meantime, I also learned drums and bass and keyboards, and I've been playing keyboards, I guess, about 12 years, and then started trying to figure out how to play all the instruments on my own records, because in the area that I was in Memphis, especially back then, there was very few people, and remains very few people, into kind of progressive instrumental music there. So I didn't really have a choice. If I wanted to do it, I kind of had to learn to play all the instruments myself to be my own band on my tapes.
Do you like any rock-oriented music?
Very much, yeah, very much. That's what I grew up on. And as far as in rock guitar, one of the biggest people for me was Billy Gibbons, and still is. The records Fandango and Rio Grande Mud and Tres Hombres are just the epitome, you know, I think, of guitar. And you might can hear it a little bit, and when I play, I can demonstrate a little bit of how that influences me. The thing about Gibbons I always liked was the way he did this kind of vibrato on the D string. And most of the strings in the guitar won't do it. It's just the D string. And if you do, excuse me, the D string right, And if you vibrato it a certain way, it sounds like there's something in the frequencies going a little bit, and you can't always get it, but... Sometimes Gibbons would actually pull the note off the fretboard. What's that one? Another thing that appealed to me, particularly about him, that's influenced me, is the way he vibratoed chords, like I was just doing there in Brown Sugar, or like in Beer Drinkers and Hellraisers. That's one where he pulls the note off the neck. So he was a big influence on me. And I always really liked guitar to where there was a certain character to the notes. There was a certain thing in the vibrato, but the vibrato alone, that's just kind of maybe a little bit too broad a way to describe it. It's not just when people say this guy's got good vibrato or this guy doesn't have good vibrato. To me, that's kind of an overgeneralization, because a lot of these things that give the playing character could fall under the general category of vibrato, but are really more like note shaping. It's like how do you articulate each different note? And with that kind of playing particularly, so just doing something like that, if you were going, well, the subtlety would be you'd go. So if the first time you played this note, you're bending it up, not really a quarter tone, maybe an eighth tone. And then another eighth tone, and then maybe play this note, and then slide up to this note, and vibrato it kind of slowly at first, but then increase the speed after that. So it's, you know, you can break down just a phrase that simple, just... And you can find all these different note-shaping elements in that. And so I try to maintain that kind of playing and touch in simple and in complicated terms. So, and that kind of goes back to what I believe about technique and what's considered technique. Again, there's kind of a general misconception, I believe, about technique. And a lot of times it's referred to mainly as scales and the ability to play scales fast and things like that. And people will say things like Hendrix was a soulful player, and say Yngwie is a technical player or something like that. And it's just ridiculous, because Hendrix had some of the most unbelievable technique. If, again, in a similar fashion as what I was talking about there, if you break down any few bars of what he's talking about, you're going to hear, you know, there might be a whole tone bend and then an eighth note bend, and then he may do the vibrato, start on a fast vibrato and gradually slow it down, and then get one more bend in. You know, it's just, it's how close you want to relatively analyze these things. And in a player such as that, I believe it's highly technical. In his case, he has some of the greatest abilities to shape the different notes with little subtle things. So I believe that's, and one of the things I struggle with the most on guitar is to really just to try to play in tune, because the guitar is just a pretty hard instrument just to even make the notes in tune. And that's, again, to go back to the Indian music briefly, is that because they don't modulate, it's all in one. It's all in one key. There doesn't have to be any tempered system. It's all a pure scale. And there's something about hearing. In Indian music, you have these pure thirds that just grab you. And in the West, in our normal well-tempered system for piano, the thirds and the other intervals are slightly off, you know, to the beat system. They're tuned out a little bit so that you can play in all the different keys. But in listening to the Eastern music, it so increases my pitch sensitivity. And so when I do listen back to maybe things I play, the thing that'll cause me most to like gag or whatever is if I hear a note that's, you know, not the note that I intended. Maybe it's off an eighth tone or things like that. And I probably didn't used to hear that way, but the older I get and the longer I play, the more sensitive I'm getting to be able to hear a half step or a quarter step or even an eighth tone.